There we go. Hello. How are we
Yay!
doing?
Hey, how y'all doing?
Good.
Yeah,
Good.
let's pretend we haven't talked before.
Yes. So do you
That
want
makes
to
life-
introduce Paul to us, Felipe?
Yes, let me introduce Paul Quin to everybody. He's an entertainment lawyer based in Tampa, Florida. He's a partner at Saxon Gilmore and Caraway, and he represents many of our drumming heroes.
Really?
I'm not sure if he does represent Virgil behind
I
Mark.
don't.
No.
I don't.
Okay. Uh, could you please, Paul, start telling us a little bit of your history and why you became a lawyer?
Oh, absolutely. Well, I want to just start by something current to say that I actually have an honors degree in American Studies from Manchester University. I have a master's degree in American History from LSU and a law degree from the University of Iowa. But I dropped out of high school when I was 16. And I did it because at the time I was playing in a new wave of British heavy metal rock band by the name of Tora Tora, who later became Tora. And we were just the perennial opening act for every band that came around. And I remember getting a call from management that said, we're going to have to find a new drummer because you're still in high school. And I said, no, oh, no, I'm not. No. And then had to go explain that to my parents about, hey, by the way, I'm no longer in high school and I'm going on the road next week. So, but I did go back later and get a little educated. I went to a community college to do the equivalent of A-levels in Manchester, Fielden Park Community College. And from there managed to BS my way into Manchester University on the American Studies course. But before all that happened, I played music for a number of years for some fairly well-known folks, one-off gigs, did a lot of recording sessions in Manchester.
Yeah, I've heard about Danger Mouse.
Danger Mouse, yep. Cosgrove Hall were a Manchester animation studio. And so there was an animator there, I have no idea what he's doing now, by the name of Stuart something. And he had formed this band called Stuart and the Abstractions. And so I played some shows with them, and from there parlayed my way into working at Pluto Recording Studios to do some work for Cosgrove Hall. So I played with people like Mike Harding in those days, if you remember, Northern Manchester comedian Mike Harding. But so yeah, I did the terrible work, between bands. I played working men's clubs as a dep drummer, including a horrible 4-month period playing at Appley Bridge Royal British Legion outside Wigan, where we'd have to play all those songs, 3 or 4 acts every night, most with no music, just get up and play along. And at the time I was playing with everybody else who would ask me, but so ended up signing a management deal that sent me into bankruptcy at 19. So I never read it. Just, never crossed my mind that it wouldn't be a good idea to sign it. And frankly, even if I'd read it, I was still going to sign it. So, but it allowed our manager to take 17.5% 7 times. So while I was expecting, big paycheck at the end of the year, we got nothing, and I ended up in trouble. So I decided, after I moved to the US in 1990, I moved to just outside New Orleans. And I went there just to play music. So I played in a bunch of blues bands, played with some pretty major blues folks, got to jam with some major blues folks because I knew all the people that owned the clubs. So I got to play with Larry Garner and Buddy Guy and a whole bunch of other folks. And they used to like my shuffle. Don't know why, because when I first moved to Baton Rouge, I don't think I really knew how to shuffle. But you try playing the blues and not be able to play a good shuffle, you're in trouble. So went to law school down the line. I did not start law school till I was 31, and came out with quite a lot of debt. So worked to learn my trade by working for a major litigation company, 500 lawyers all across the United States, representing people like Johnson & Johnson and Eli Lilly and Wyeth Laboratories and Philip Morris. And then eventually, that was in Kansas City. They wanted to open an office down in Tampa. They asked me if I would like to go and help open the office. I did. I hated the people that worked in that office. They were miserable human beings. And so I started looking for another job. I went to Stax and Gilmore and made the deal with them essentially, which said, we need you to spend 60% of your time helping us with our litigation clients, because that's what you have experience on, but we will support you to develop your own practice area as much as you want. And because, as you all know, the industry is very small, I just called on clients I knew, people I knew over the years, and that, you know, went from one thing to another. I think the first major client I represented in the music world was John Blackwell. And I did everything for him. And I even produced his solo album. I mean, hired my clients, we recorded it at Drum Channel, DW facility in Oxnard, California. I'm a DW artist, so I had those connections to get it done. And then we used Paul Pesco on guitar, who played with, he's one of my clients who plays with Madonna and Mariah Carey and Hall & Oates and Joan Baez and a million other folks. Got Will Lee to play bass on it. I think he is now officially the most recorded bass player in history.
Really?
Although I think Chuck Rainey might have an argument about that. And then we had a young, very talented jazz piano player called Corey Bernhardt, and then a bunch of other guests. We brought in David Garfield, who's the musical director for George Benson. We had Esperanza Spalding singing on something. And I even flew over to the UK to have my sister sing on one of the tunes. She's a very well-known session singer in the north of England. She's been doing it since she was 18. Thousands of jingles, thousands of albums she's sung on. So she did the lead vocal on one of the tracks, and it was killer. So
cool.
And then I just, you know, went from one drummer to another, and now, you know, I represent Russ Miller, I represent Bernard Purdy, I've done work for Stanton Moore, I've done work for Steve Gadd, Vinnie Colaiuta, and a million more. As you mention them, I'll remember whether or not I've done work for them.
Okay. Who's next?
I've got a question.
Okay, hopefully I have an answer.
Quite a lot. But, I'm just curious, with the drummers that you represent, is there like a common thing that you're asked to do? Is there a most common agreement or something that you need to look over?
Well, it depends. Sometimes I will help them with their endorsement deals. Now, endorsements are something that's changed dramatically, and I can address endorsements if you have specific questions, but sometimes I do that. Often these guys will be doing their own solo projects. So I'll do all the deals, the copyrights, the agreement with the other musicians, get that set up. Sometimes I help them negotiate their tour riders and their rate for going on tour. You know, and again, that's something that's been stagnant pretty much since, you know, the early 2000s. You know, the rate for the A-list guys on the big A-list tours since the early 2000s, the max rate has been about $10,000 a week. That's how much these guys get paid on the road. But that rate, as times have changed, that rate has either stayed the same or gone down, which is a bit of a struggle. But, you know, it's hard to complain when you're still getting paid $8,000 a week. But the problem is there just aren't that many of those gigs. I know Steve Gadd managed to negotiate himself an even better deal with James Taylor, but that's because he's Steve Gadd, right? You know, if someone calls him and they say, "Why do you deserve to be paid X?" I think he just has to say, "I'm Steve Gadd," and then they go, "Okay, done. That makes perfect sense."
I'll try that next time. I'm Steve Gadd. See, that helps.
You should try that. You know, I met Steve Gadd when I was 18, and made such a fool of myself when I met him. I was so tongue-tied. I couldn't even get my name out. And thankfully, I was with him probably a year or so ago. I was negotiating a contract for a percussionist called Pedrito Martinez. And if you're not familiar with Pedrito, you should go look him up. He's the Jimi Hendrix of the congas, I think. But thankfully, Steve did not remember meeting me all those years ago at the Wellington pub in Stockport when he was recording for 10cc. Because when he was introduced to me and I put my hand out, I'd had a couple of beers, by the way, and I didn't think I was going to meet him because it was a closed session. So I'd gone to the pub to wait for my bus. And when he put his hand out and said, "What's your name?" I put my hand out and said, "Steve Gadd." And he smiled at me and said, "No, I don't think so. I think I'm Steve Gadd." And I was like, "Yes, I've got to go." So thankfully, he didn't remember that. But after I told him the story and we laughed and hugged, he then introduced me to David Sanborn as Steve Gadd. I'm like, "Thanks."
Mark?
Yeah, so I don't know if that really fully answers your question, but yes, I do everything that they need. And frankly, with some of the guys, because I'm a member of a firm that does other work, we'll also do people's wills, trusts, estates, form their LLCs, form their corporations, do the operating agreement. The only thing I don't give them is tax advice. I send them to a tax lawyer for that because it's so specialized and I don't want to get it wrong.
Cool.
Also, I help some drummers, some musicians that have done a lot of sessions are sometimes don't know about sound exchange. So I think it's different in the well, it is different in the UK, but the United States does not pay performance royalties to musicians who are not owners of the copyright. So if you are a drummer, bass player, guitar player who doesn't have the copyright on something, unless you record it through a union session, which really only means the stuff recorded in LA, usually for a film or a TV or a major record company, you don't get any repeat fees and any residuals. Everything is done as a work for hire. But, and anytime it's played on the radio or played anywhere else or on TV as a musician, unless it's done under a union contract, you don't receive any more money. But Sound Exchange is this governmental run performance royalties company that pays musicians a percentage of the royalties generated by performance for just playing on the song, whether you own the copyright or not. So for a couple of guys, for Denny Sywell, who used to play with Wings, and for Bernard Purdy, I've helped set him up on Sound Exchange. Because, you know, that can be, especially if you're Bernard, right? And you've played on Aretha Franklin and Steely Dan and all this other stuff. That stuff gets paid a lot on digital radio, you know, and there are performance royalties waiting to be earned. So
Cool.
we do that too.
So I wanted to, it's quite a broad question. I wanted to sort of get your thoughts on kind of the digital media side of things, piracy, that kind of thing. I don't really have a specific question, but kind of, do you have any general thoughts on its effect on the industry and like where it's going to go legally?
Listen, piracy is always going to exist, and the nature of the globalization of the industry through the internet and through digital media means piracy is always going to be virtually impossible to shut down. And the reason is because you may be able to shut it down in the UK, right? If somebody's pirating your stuff in the UK, you can take actions. But if they're doing it in Venezuela or China or Argentina, you're really limited as to what actions you can effectively take. Now, the only action you're really left with is to isolate the media in which they're transferring. So if it's on Spotify or Pandora or one of those things, you can contact them, and as long as you can establish that you own the rights to it, they'll pull it down. In the US, there's something called the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, which gives safe harbor to those internet providers so they can't be sued for violating copyright as long as they take certain actions within a specified statutory period of time. So, for example, if YouTube, I'm sure you've experienced this, if not yourselves, but from people you know, that they will post a cover playing along with something on YouTube, playing along with the original, and they'll get a notice, a takedown notice from YouTube, right? So before the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, any purveyor of a copyright violation could be sued. So what this act did is it gave protection to YouTube and other companies that as long as they pull it down within a 48-hour time period of being notified it's a violation, they can't be sued. So what's happened is, first of all, because of that, there is massive amount of copyright violation. The YouTube partnership program will sometimes allow the copyright holder to receive a percentage of up to 50% of the money that is being paid to the YouTube channel subscriber. But YouTube is physically unable to police its input. I read recently, and it might have changed, but there is something like 28 hours of videos uploaded every 30 seconds on YouTube. So there aren't enough people to police what goes up. So they expect people to self-police. And you can put Google alerts and YouTube alerts so that if somebody does your stuff. And so listen, some artists are absolutely manic about having things pulled down. The Eagles, right? Don't even post yourself singing Hotel California because it won't last 2 days. Prince, when he was still alive, Prince was absolutely manic on having any covers of any of his material immediately pulled down from YouTube. So the piracy thing is just something I think we have to police, but we have to just accept that it's going to happen. The biggest problem I think we have is convincing a younger generation of musicians that music has value. So it's not so much the piracy that's damaging it, it's the sense of entitlement that I should be able to have this for free. And sometimes I get sent messages. There was actually somebody sent me a message underneath one of my YouTube videos that said, hey, you might want to help out these people over here because, you know, they're being threatened with being shut down, their YouTube channel. And so I went to look at their GoFundMe page and their channel, and they were being threatened for being shut down because they were violating people's copyrights. And all they were saying is, yeah, but we're not making any money off it, and we think people want to see it. Well, big deal. You know, I mean, great. I'm glad you want to see it, but the person that wrote it deserves to be paid for it because that's the way this is supposed to work. So I declined to help. You know, I represent people who try to generate revenue through the music industry. So I'm not about to help somebody who takes that revenue from somebody else.
Do you think
Cool.
sorry, just one more. Do you think there needs to be any specific changes to how the law deals with these kind of things now?
Well, I think it would be nice if the law differentiated, and it does to a certain extent, in the US at least, it does, about people who do it for profit. So for example, I had a client a while ago who suddenly became, and he had died. It was actually his wife I was dealing with. He was an old time kind of Frank Sinatra type singer. And he became aware that a company in Las Vegas had literally burned copies of his CDs, reprinted the artwork, and was selling them through CD Baby as if they owned the copyright in them. Now, something as blatant as that, those folks can be shut down, you know, and we did. But the other problem is, you know, this is such a litigious society, and also in the US, there's no loser pays statute. So the question becomes, how much money is this costing you? And is it sufficiently more than the cost of filing a federal copyright lawsuit? Now, the advantage of federal copyright lawsuits here is there's a fee switching provision within the statute. So if you win, the other side gets to pay you fees. But of course, there's no, can't get blood from a stone. So sometimes the person that's ripped you off may be in violation, but it might have cost you $50, $60, $100, $150, $250,000 to win that case. So if that person is wealthy, bonus, you know, you can get all that money back. But, you know, if they don't have it, you can't get it. So there are problems within the system. But the fines for the deliberate violation, the word in the statute is willful, for the willful violation of copyright, can be extreme. They can be up to $300 per violation. And every time somebody streams your tune, that's a copyright violation. So, you know, it's not uncommon to have damages for millions of dollars for a song that's generated less than $10,000 in revenue. So, but you know, this is kind of tangential, but I think it's relevant, which is you constantly hear musicians complaining about how streaming revenue is destroying the artists, right? I'm sure you've all had those discussions. Oh my God, we used to get this and now we only get this. I need 10,000 streams before I get 30 cents and all this other stuff. And while all that is true, it has been a masterpiece of misdirection by the major labels to have people focus on it. Because the truth of the matter is, labels are making more money than they have ever made in that. Now, this is pre-Corona, right? So Corona's put a big dent in all that. So let's pretend we don't have the Corona thing going on right now. But streaming revenue now accounts for, between the three major labels, close to $1 billion a month.
Bloody hell.
So what's happened is they make deals because they have, you know, either ownership interest or some other stuff going on with Spotify. It's not always an ownership interest. Sometimes it's just the license they provide in order to be able to play that stuff. They figure it out so that the majority of the money goes for the owner of the sound recording, right? And then the labels make big time deals for all their artists. So the labels are making a killing and the artists are getting screwed. Now, here's the great thing about that. That's the way it's always been.
Yeah.
Right?
I was going to ask, what's the difference?
Yeah.
So, you know, new boss, same as the old boss, you know,
exactly.
But the problem is there's been such a skillful job done of misdirection that, you know, even when I meet some of my more established friends in the industry, you know, I had this conversation at NAMM this year with Leland Sklar and Steve Lukather, and neither of them were really fully aware that that's the way it was, that it's the label again that's screwing you as opposed to the system. Now, everything you do in life, right, is about leverage, right? So the question is, who has the leverage to change it? And some people, Taylor Swift and others, have done a phenomenal job of trying to redress that balance. You know, when Taylor Swift signed her last record deal with a new label, she made a deal with them that within the next 10 years, that label would sell all the shares they owned in Spotify. And the money they generated would be split amongst all the artists on that label.
Wow.
Wow.
Yeah, I mean, just makes you love Taylor Swift. And I'm not really a fan. But, you know, after that, I'm like, well, I shouldn't go out.
Do I have to listen to her to start loving her?
Yeah.
I love it.
That's amazing.
Yeah, so, you know, listen, and there are definitely wonderful people who want to do the right thing out there, but, you know, they're beaten up by, you know, what's really happening in the music industry is exactly the same as is happening in society at large, which is that the power and the money is being accumulated more and more into the hands of the few. Right, that is what is happening. So, you know, Elton John and Sting and Coldplay, they're all going to be fine. You know, this contraction in the industry is not really hurting them. And they have the leverage to make sure they get paid appropriately from streaming. But up and coming artists are struggling. And so they have to learn how to take advantage of this digital medium to help themselves. You know, there are things, I think I'm older than all of you, but there are clearly massive advantages. You know, when I was a young musician, 18, 19, 20, if you wanted to record something that was of releasable quality, you had no choice, go into a recording studio that was going to cost you $300 to $400 an hour, right, to record there. And, you know, and I'm sure as drummers, you all know, sometimes it would take 3 or 4 hours to get a good drum sound. And if you're paying that for yourself, you know, all the other guys in the band are going, we're up to £1,000 now, and the snare drum sound still sounds terrible, you know. So, but the truth is, no one needs to do that anymore. You know, I mean, everybody has some kind of home recording, and the more elaborate it is, the greater quality of product that you can produce from home. So then the question becomes, what does the label do for you that you can't do for yourself? And really, the truth is entirely in marketing.
Yeah.
Right? They can have your stuff played in different places. They can have it on any brick and mortar store to the extent they still exist. And they can promote and push it through support acts and all the things. And that's the thing the independent musician finds hard to do. Now, I always used to lecture and say, that the essential difference was, if you wanted to be able to play music full-time for a living, pay your bills, have a car, and live comfortably but not wealthily, you have a better chance of doing that under this digital system than you had before. It was much more of a feast or famine approach before. But if your goal and how you define success is 6 cars and 3 houses and 2 swimming pools, you still need a label. And there's one guy who blew that theory for me. But I think one guy does not necessarily make the theory wrong. It just allows for an exception. You know?
Exactly.
So Chance the Rapper came around and managed to change the world and do everything himself and make millions of dollars. You know, so, but I think he's just an outlier, and I haven't seen anybody else do it yet. Although, you know, Billie Eilish started that way. And, you know, she absolutely is very, very skillful, and a management team very skillful at using the power of social media. My daughter alerted me last week that Billie Eilish has 64 million Instagram followers.
Wow.
So, you know, if you want to make prior to social media, if you wanted to make a press announcement that would reach 64 million people, it was impossible.
Yeah.
You know, front page on Billboard, pay for the New York Times, let's put a sign in Times Square. You know, no, she just sends a message out on Instagram and 64 million people know what she's doing.
But
so
also,
there are really advantages. Go ahead.
yeah, but as you were mentioning, like Chance is the exception that proves the rule, let's say.
Yep.
Back in the 80s, MC Hammer was kind of the same thing, because he was making a good living selling his albums out of the trunk of his car.
Yeah.
And then when
he went on to make billions before.
Exactly. And I watched an interview with him where he said that the first time a record label approached him, he didn't sign because it was not worth it. He would make more money still selling out of the trunk of his car. So you always have exceptions.
Yeah, well, Dave Matthews was a bit similar, really, because you know, he managed to get the leverage to get the right deal for him. You know, so a standard record deal in the 80s, 90s would give 12 to 15% of net to the artist, right? The record company would take the rest. So Dave was doing so well as a live act and selling their CDs, you know, online, that when the labels came to him and said, hey, you know, man, you played to 250,000 people last year, and we really think we could work together, he would say, why? What do you bring to the table? You know, why do I have to give you 80% of everything when I'm doing just fine? Because 100% of, you know, less is worth a lot more than 12% of more, you know? So he ended up stroking a deal which gave him 50% of gross.
Wow.
You know, so it's all about leverage and negotiation. And that's something a lot of young artists don't appreciate. They think the label will do everything for them, right? The label will release, market, and will provide you a fan base. You've got to be up on it to go do those things yourself. You know, I mean, we're talking bands rather than, you know, educators or session guys right now, but that's the truth.
So is that your advice, is just for a young band to just try and get as much leverage as you can on your own before you
100%. Listen, if a young band comes to me and they say, what can I do to get the attention of labels? Right, I'm going to tell you. Do you remember, Felipe, you might remember, but in the 80s, right, when you were playing in a band that had a little bit of a local following and you were doing quite well, the record label would send somebody out to see you.
Yeah.
And the truth is, they weren't coming to see you to see if you were good. They were coming out to see you to see how many people you were drawing, right? What was the crowd reaction? Could they parlay this into something else? Well, you know, what happens now is A&R guys, if they hear of you or you come to their attention, they look on your Facebook page. What's your how many fans have you got? How long's your page been open? If your page has been open for a year and a half and you've got 320 fans on your page, they've just lost interest. So yes, you have to do everything you can to raise your profile.
And I just heard the other week on a video by Rick Beato that he said that he talked to 2 A&R guys, and they said now the first thing they check is TikTok.
Yeah.
even
Yeah,
before
TikTok is a
Facebook
big
or
deal.
anything.
Although, you know, I can count on the fingers of one hand the number of times I've actually looked on TikTok. Not counting the times my 15-year-old son brings me asinine videos to watch. But yeah, I mean, that's true. TikTok, Instagram, Twitter, they're all looking. They want to know how big your social media footprint is. And, but it's the same for all those things. You know, I can't tell you how often I get contacted by young up-and-coming drummers who say, I want an endorsement. Well, let's set aside the fact that that's a stupid question, because the companies don't endorse you. You endorse the companies, right? That's the way it works. No company is saying, you're a great drummer. They're not, you know. But my question always to them is, well, what are you bringing to the table? And I get, you know, young kids will tell me, yeah, but so-and-so has an endorsement, and I'm a much better drummer than he is. Guess what? How many people are you playing to each year? You know, are you reaching 100,000, 150,000? I mean, on your, if you have a YouTube page, how many people are liking you? And, you know, one of the great things that's really moving forward is the companies are learning that the most influential endorsees are, I'm sorry, endorsers, I'm getting it wrong. The most influential endorsers are teachers. You know, if you have a very large teaching practice, especially if you're doing internet stuff, that it is more likely that your students will buy equipment because you play it than it is people will buy a DW kit because Ray Luzier is playing, right? Actually, does Ray Luzier play DW? I don't think he does.
I think he plays Pearl.
I think he plays Pearl too, yeah.
No.
Filippo,
Sorry, Ray.
Filippo and I have talked about this quite a lot, and it's interesting, sort of in my time playing, how especially the smaller companies approach endorsements, because I've been approached a couple of times. So I've only got one endorsement at the moment for practice pads, because my students buy loads of them. But I was approached by a stick company on Instagram. I'm not going to name them. And I had a long phone conversation with the guy saying, look, you know, this is my teaching setup. I teach this many people, and they're going purely on the social media numbers rather than sort of I mean, I've rattled out sales figures to him, and they seem to be, there's a lot of the smaller companies using it as like a sales conduit, if that makes sense, like directly. But
well,
they're not.
That started with a company here in Tampa, a drum company, D-Drum.
Right.
When D-Drum first launched, what they essentially did is send emails out to every young drummer in this area and said, would you like to become an endorser of D-Drum? And so these kids were like, oh, I've been contacted, you know, a company. And so then they would sell them the stuff at a factory discount and stick them on their website. And it was a piece of genius marketing tool, because it allowed these kids to inflate their ego and say, oh yeah, I endorse DW drums. Although, I'm sorry, D-Drum. Of course, most of them would say, I am endorsed by D-Drum, which is not true. You know, the most important thing to understand in approaching endorsements, right, is the A&R guys at these companies. What department of the company are they with? Do you know?
No.
They're part of the marketing department, right? So what's in it for them to give you free gear? How does that advance the marketing of the company, or even reduce price gear? So, you know, I mean, the question is, how many people are you influencing? How many people are likely to buy that product because you play it? And this might sound cynical, but it really doesn't matter how good you are. It really doesn't. I mean, it helps, you know, and if you want, there was also a time when the companies would, you know, pay for clinics and you know, those days are going. Now, I'm not going to say they're gone, because there are still a few people that manage to score money for clinics. But, you know, there was a time when lots of drums were doing drum clinics and being paid by the companies to do it.
Well, John Famularo made his living in the 80s and 90s because of drum clinics, basically.
Yeah. Well, Dom still does clinics. But, you know, frankly, I don't have a problem with the fact that there are fewer drummers doing clinics. Because what used to happen was drummers who were between tours, not recording an album, not getting paid on retainer, would contact these companies to say, let me do some clinics, right? And if they were established, the companies would do it when they had money, which they don't have now. But when they did, they would do it. But being a great drummer, being a good drummer, playing in a successful band does not make you a good clinician. And you know this as well as anybody. Being a great player does not make you a great teacher, right? There are other skills involved in teaching that some great players don't have. And I'm sure we've all been to clinics and watched guys just blow absurd chops that we can't do, right? Or I'll just talk for myself, not for you, that I can't do. But I find that entertaining, and I don't leave that clinic with a sense of, I can't wait to get home and practice, you know? There are some marvelous clinicians out there. Pat Petrillo is a great clinician. Jim Riley from Rascal Flatts is a great clinician. Every clinic I've ever been to that he's done, and he's a friend, so I'll go see him if he's ever around. But you know, you leave that clinic going, I want to go home and practice that thing there, because I can remember what it was simply explained, and it's something I can actually use in my playing. So, and Dom is, Dom's one of the best clinicians ever. I mean, he's an incredible drum soloist. I mean, his technique is flawless, and he's an inspirational guy. I mean, I've worked closely with him with the sessions and everything else for years and years. I've traveled the world with him. And, he's an inspiration, and he's genuine. And that's the key to actually being inspirational. Be genuine. I think I went off on a tangent, Felipe.
That was a good tangent.
I have a question back to bands. I think because I've been in so many, and I've been in that dreaded place where you want to kind of get serious and you want to talk about, well, if we're successful, and you talk about how you're going to split songwriting and stuff like that. And one part of me thinks, is there any point in having that conversation because you make so little? Or, if you haven't even signed anything yet, what's the point? However, the other part of me thinks, well, what was I say? Lost my train of thought.
Well, let's sorry to interrupt you. I had a similar question, which would be, when do you think it's necessary to have a written agreement?
Well, that's a really good question. I will tell you, early, but not ridiculously early, but certainly before you're successful, right? Everybody is in favor of sharing everything equally until suddenly the money starts coming.
Yeah.
That's the truth. So yes, do it early, and there should always be a written agreement amongst band members. Let's come back to the issue of copywriting and songwriting in a second, okay? But the agreement needs to address a number of things, right? So every band member should have an intra-band agreement, which should, the most litigious, believe it or not, the thing that people get sued about the most is who has the right to use the band name should the band split up. Right, so that should absolutely be in the agreement. And if it's a 5-piece band, you can say no one can use the name unless any 3 of us are involved. Or if it's a band where one person is the songwriter, you can say no one can use the band name unless that person is in it. Or if you want to, you can say no one can use the band name unless all 5 of us are members of the band. I wouldn't necessarily recommend that, because you can generate a great name, and I hate to say this, but I am a drummer, so drummers and bass players tend to be looked at as more fungible members of a band than your lead guitarist. I mean, it shouldn't be that way, but it is. But those things get litigated all the time, and I also like to put in my band agreement things that say when you, first of all what your obligations are, right? Turning up to gigs on time, rehearsing, if you're the lead guitarist, not bringing your girlfriend.
Have you actually had that in a deal at any point?
I've had to put in deals that say no guests at rehearsals.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, because people, rehearsals, it's work, right? I don't bring friends to the office when I'm getting ready to litigate. Hey, come hang out. It's work. Right?
Bring some beers.
I also put obligations. right? Sober, supposed to be sober, drug-free when you turn up, things like that. But the most important thing in that agreement is how you split profit, right? Do you take some aside to pay for joint things? You know, if the band owns a PA, that the band owns equally? Do you take, so what about gas for the van, repairs for the van? Does everybody pay their own gas? You know, joint equipment. I think each musician should be responsible for their own equipment, right? But stuff that the whole band uses, there's a reason to maybe take something out of the pot and keep that in a bank account. I think it's generally a good idea for a band to form some kind of business entity, a limited liability company or something like that, because otherwise you'll be viewed as a partnership. I think you need to have an agreement that talks about how you deal with losses. You know, if you tank at a gig and you don't make any money, how do you deal with that? But all those things need to be in a band agreement. But coming back to the issue of copyright and sharing songwriting ownership, this is a big deal, and it's something that you need to think back about leverage too. So, you know, normally in a band, not always, bear in mind the only thing that you can copyright are lyrics and melody, right? So your drum groove can't be copywritten, your bass part can't be copywritten. So the question would be, normally what would happen is the copyrights would belong to the person that write, or the people that write the lyrics and the melody. But some bands always take the position that all writing credits are shared by everybody that's in the room at the time the song is written. But you need to get that in writing up front, because that's not a big deal. Yeah, of course we'll share everything before you have a top 10 hit, right? You know, I always used to laugh at a story that Stuart Copeland used to tell about how everybody was ecstatic with how much money they were making in the Police, until they realized how much money Sting was making because of his power of the copyright, you know. And then when they're pulling up in their Porsche and Sting's pulling up in his Lamborghini, then they were like, oh, that's not right. So, but, you know, other bands like, you know, Steve Lukather always says, whoever's in the room shares the writing credit. And I think, you know, that's just something you need to get and put it in writing right at the very beginning, because that writing is easy to get agreement on it before you're successful and impossible to get agreement on after you're successful. Now, I'll also tell you as kind of a subset of that, if you're a session player, right, or you're being booked to go play with somebody else, it's very hard for you to ask for a percentage of the copyright. And so all I would suggest is let's wait and see how much you add to the song before you ask. So if you go in there and you completely change the tempo, the groove, the feel, the lope of the song, you may have an argument, say to the songwriter, you know, I've really put my creative spin on this, and I think, you know, I'd like to request that you give me 10% of the copyright, 15% of the copyright. But you have to be prepared for them to say no. And if they say no, you have to be prepared to say, okay. You might not want to work with them again, but that's the way it goes.
So we got about 10 minutes left, I think. And Felipe's frozen or fallen asleep.
Yeah, one of the two. That happens all the time while I'm talking.
Do you mind if I ask a quick question, Kira?
Yeah, go.
I wanted to talk more about drumming, actually. So you're playing DW? So
yeah, and Zildjian.
Oh, cool. Okay. So do you still get time to practice on your own? And what are you working on if you do?
I'm a groove player. I am not a chops guy, really. And I know that's kind of a cop-out, frankly. Welcome back, Felipe.
Thank you.
I know that's kind of a cop-out, but all the drummers I love are pocket players. Right? Everyone, you know, whether it's Jeff Porcaro, Steve Gadd, Steve Jordan, Steve Ferroni. Apparently I like the Steves. But, you know, that's what I want to do. I want to fit into that pocket as well as I possibly can. So listen, I work on a pad and I do technique and all those other things, but I've been playing these gigs with this acoustic guitar player where he plays so many notes that drum kit has too many overtones and it drowns him out, right? Or interferes with his finesse. So I've been doing these gigs with a cajon with a bass drum pedal and with a 10-inch Latin percussion wooden snare cajon, which I put on a snare stand, and with a hi-hat and a ride cymbal. Now, so in essence, I'm playing drum kit patterns. I'm not a percussionist. I'm not playing, you know, around the beat with all wackiness. I'm just playing kind of standard grooves. I use Vic Firth's version of the hot rods. I don't remember what they're called, but I use those to play with. And you can play anything that you can play on a kit with this, because I got pedal, I got a hi-hat, I got a snare drum, and I got sticks. But learning to play without any toms and with nothing but hi-hat, ride cymbal, snare drum, and bass drum has been one of the most valuable learning experiences I've ever had with drums. Because while I understand there is a limit to this, right? But generally, the more sounds you have, the more interesting you can make simple things. You can fool people you're much better if you have 5 toms, right? Because you can play all this melodic stuff. Just to practice with a bass drum and a snare drum and a hi-hat, and play along to tunes and fill properly and be dynamic, and it has been one of the best learning things I've ever been through. I play a lot of paradiddles and double paradiddles in the groove.
Yeah.
Right? Just because it keeps that interest and the dynamic between the hi-hat and the snare drum. So, you know, I work on that a lot, because I don't know if you've ever done it. It's hard. I mean, it really is. And then just to complicate things, I remember Jojo Mayer telling me once that the best practice you can ever do is to set your metronome to about 120 beats per minute, and then play an 8-bar solo, but only play 8 notes. And make it interesting and make it musical.
Yeah.
And it's really, really difficult. It's real, because it doesn't take you. I can't usually get into the second bar before I'm at least doing a dum on the bass drum, you know, and snuck in a 16th note and blew it, you know. So I think some of the, once, you know, you always have to practice technique. You always have to practice rudiments. You always have to practice your hands and your feet and all those things that we all have to do, right? But the best practice I would tell people to do is just to think musically, right? I see a lot of young drummers that have clearly learned a pattern, right? This song that I have to play has a basic pattern of dum, bap, dum, dum, bap, dum, bap, right? And so that's what they play for the song. And you can almost watching them zone out, not listening to what the people around them are doing. And so thinking musically and remembering that the performance of music is supposed to be a musical conversation between the people on stage. You know, you have 2 ears, and that should be the greatest tool of any musician, are your ears. Right? You have to listen to what everybody else is doing and react accordingly. And, you know, Liberty DeVito always says before he did any session, he would read the lyrics. Steve Gadd does the same thing. He reads the lyrics. Because and I gotta tell you, I think I'd been playing 25 years before I gave a shit what the lyrics were. You know, I'm like, what? Lyrics? Who cares? What's the bass playing? You know, but that advice helps you become a better musician. Maybe not a better drummer, but a better musician. And I got news for you. Musicians get hired much more than drummers.
Right. Cool. So we got 5 minutes. One more question, maybe?
Do you have the question?
No, I'm good, actually.
Okay.
I do have one.
Okay, cool.
What do you think for the future? They say it takes 66 days to change habits. And if everything goes to what it was before Corona, when on the 1st of June, that's what people are saying here in the UK, things are going to start going back to what they used to be. It's going to be
I don't believe that. But
I don't believe that, but let's say it is true. And it's going to be 69 days. Do you think it's ever going to go back to what it used to be before Corona? Like people going out?
One day. Honestly, I think we are going to need to have a vaccine before it goes back to normal. Because, you know, we've been socially isolating to flatten the curve and all those other things. And I understand the economy is hurting, and I understand all that, and I also understand how privileged I am to still be able to make a living while working from home. So that puts me in the minority, and it's not because I'm deaf to the problems with other people. But I don't think the concert live performance business is going to go back to how it was before until people, not the bands, not the venues, not the owners of the venues, until the people that go to those venues feel safe attending. And, you know, here we are on May the 16th, right? 18th, sorry, May the 18th. Here we are on May the 18th. And I would not go to a 15,000 person concert today. Why does anyone think it will have changed in 2 weeks? You know, California is talking about holding no sizable concerts until January of 2022. So the question is, we as musicians, how are we going to deal with that? What are we going to do? How are we, because listen, you can watch 1 million performances on Facebook Live, right? You can see people doing Zoom performances and a cappella performances and all these things. And the problem is most of them are terrible. Most of them are not good. You know, the audio's not good. It's not the level of work goes into those that people put into a live show. So that, you know, they think that they can nail it by sitting down with an acoustic guitar and a crappy camera on their phone and attract people. And well, they can't, you know, at least not to the extent where people want to pay for it. So us as musicians and as members of this industry, we have to work out how to adapt to the changes. Musicians are nothing if not creative, and they adapt to change. They do. So how are we going to do it to monetize what we do? So yeah, music in the background, that's my son playing it.
Cool. Excellent. That's quite a good place to end there. Thanks very much, Paul.
Oh, you're more than welcome. Listen, if you all need anything, drop me a line. I'm happy to talk to you all. And if you have thoughts, moments, if you realize something I said was nonsense, let me know and I'll fix it.
Well, I think we'll definitely have a part 2 for this because it was really interesting.
Listen, anytime. Felipe is a wonderful, wonderful human being, and
thank you very much.
Happy to do it whenever you want. And you don't have to do it formally. You know, just drop me an email and say, "Hey, can you jump on a Zoom? I want to ask you a question." That's fine with me.
Brilliant.
Cool.
Cool.
Excellent.
Guys, I'm going to stop recording. Could